You're listening to the Feed Podcast. New episodes drop every Thursday morning.
Well, in the pantheon of national holidays, you probably don't hear a lot about Foundation Day. You know what that is?
No, actually, you tipped me off that we were going to talk about it, so I went and looked it up on Wikipedia, but honest to God, I'd never heard of it before.
Of course, I hadn't either, but the nationwide holiday commemorates the accession to the throne of Japan's first human emperor in 660 BCE. He was believed to be a direct descendant of the gods and is credited with founding the Japanese Empire. The day was originally known as Empire Day in 1872, when the government first established it as a national holiday. It was abandoned after World War II and then brought back as National Foundation Day in 1966. It is observed in Japan with fireworks and speeches. One of the most elaborate parties is in Tokyo, where special rites are performed at the Imperial Sanctuary. And I say, good excuse to throw down some Japanese spirits, right, man?
I say so, too. I'm getting thirsty.
Because we talk about Japan so much, although on the show we haven't, honestly, in quite a while. But I think over the last couple of years, as we've talked about Japanese food, we've seen the spirits and the sake kind of come right along with it.
Well, for sure, the sake, I can say that. My last trip to Japan, which was a year ago, and I really spent a lot of time studying and tasting about sake, but I have to say I'm quite a neophyte when it comes to Japanese whiskey.
Me too, which is why we're doing today's show.
Okay.
Coming up on today's show, we're using the occasion of a Japanese national holiday as an excuse to talk about Japanese whiskey and sake with a pair of experts who spend much of their day sipping and analyzing both of these remarkable beverages. Stay with us. Jiro may dream of sushi, but we'd rather raise a glass. This is the Feed Podcast. I'm Steve Dolinsky, a food and travel reporter at ABC 7 News, the Chicago Tribune, and Canada's Globe and Mail.
And I'm Rick Bayless, the chef and owner of Chicago's Frontera Grill, Topolo Bampo, Shoko, Leña Brava, and the host of Public Television's Mexico One Plate at a Time.
And every week, the Feed takes a deep dive into the world of professional chefs, restaurateurs, food artisans, and drink experts, sharing their stories and uncovering their passion for food and drink. But that's not all. Rick and I are always traveling the globe for our jobs, eating, drinking, and immersing ourselves in the local culture. And if we find something exciting along the way, you can be sure it's going to find its way here to our James Beard Award-winning podcast. Kyle McHugh has spent his entire adult life working or managing bars all over the United States. He's worked in clubs, high-volume restaurants, local taverns, and in private homes. Beyond continuing his studies with the industry icons like Master Sommelier Serafin Alvarado and Master Mixologist Bridget Albert, Kyle has conducted classes of his own on beer, wine, spirits, and bartending. He's a member of the U.S. Bartenders Guild, American Homebrewers Association, and Museum of the American Cocktail, as well as a certified sommelier with the Court of Master Sommeliers. In November of 2011, he was named a Diageo Master of Whiskey, where he traveled the country representing iconic brands like Johnnie Walker, Crown Royal, Bulleit, and more. With the launch of Samson and Surrey in 2016, Kyle came aboard as Director of Brand Advocacy, overseeing all educational efforts for S&S and their family of distilleries, including Fuse Spirits and Philadelphia Distilling. Kyle McHugh, welcome to the show.
Wow,
thank you very much.
That's quite an impressive list.
It is quite an impressive bio. How did you get excited about and get interested in this industry?
The son of a bartender and the only son of a single mother bartender, so grew up at the elbow, as many of us do. Rick, I think you know that story pretty well.
I certainly do.
And you go to college and had a work-study job that just was not my style, answering phones, filing papers, very quiet.
I did one of those, too.
Ooh. And I said I could work at the bar down the street. I'm an imposing guy, doesn't play on podcasts, but 6'3", pushing 280. And I said I could be a bouncer at the bar on the corner. I know how that world works, and I could get a free burger and flirt with girls and all the soda I can drink. And that's the culture I know. So that's what got me started.
Life is good. So tell us about some of the Japanese whiskeys. You do a lot of, it's not just Japanese whiskey, obviously. You focus on so many different things. But what is it about this category, as Rick and I were alluding to earlier, it's gotten to be, is it just better marketing these days, or are they actually producing better product than they were years ago?
It's all of the above. And, we saw something like the bottle shock concept with California wine really taking a global stage. We saw something about that with world whiskey as well back around 2001 when one of the distilleries we're going to try today won an amazing blind tasting in the whiskey world. And everybody said, well, we should be paying attention to Japanese whiskey. And nowadays, it's just part of a much larger growing segment of world whiskeys, where we're seeing whiskeys from France and all over the place that are really coming to forefront. But Japanese whiskey is, of course, here to stay.
Okay, but we have these categories in our heads of American whiskey and British whiskey, and now we're talking about Japanese whiskey. So how does Japanese whiskey differ from what we produce here in the United States or the UK?
Great question. So really, for the most part, in the history of Japanese whiskey goes back to Scotland. And it was inspired by what some of the founding fathers of Japanese whiskey were. Really, we're talking about a distiller by the name of Masataka Takatsuru, who studied back in 1920, traveled to Scotland, actually earlier than that, I think 1918, traveled to Scotland to study whiskey, and met his wife there, Rita, and came back and met up with a gentleman named Shinjori Tori, who founded the company that preceded what is today Suntory, partners with our friends Jim Beam, and founded the very first Japanese-based distillery, Yamazaki. And he learned everything he knew from the Scots, and so really that dawn of Japanese whiskey making came from his time and knowledge working in Scotland.
All right, go ahead, Rick.
It is still made in that Scottish style.
Of course, that started to spread. A lot of Masataka's history really is very iconic to that Scottish style. But of course, as happens in Japan, there's that concept of kaizen, of constant improvement towards perfection, slow incremental steps, and you've seen that inspired by Scotch production, and in fact using Scotch machinery, Scotch making machinery, really then everything has taken a whole new cultural flair as it's been embedded in the flavors and histories of Japan.
My understanding is they continue to use U.S. bourbon barrels for aging, though. Is that right?
And so does Scotland. I mean, almost every drop of Scotch that you'll see is coming at some point from a former bourbon barrel. Mostly that's
because
due to
we produce a lot of bourbon barrels, and we can't reuse them.
Hey, we can't reuse them. So everybody else in the world says, we'll take those off your hand because they're pretty expensive, and they're using it. But in Japan, you'll see new American oak, used American oak, as well as former Scotch barrels, as well as French oak. I mean, anywhere you can get an interesting barrel, because as is true with so much Japanese culture, there's hugely important parts that are due to tradition, and then there's hugely important parts that are also that innovation and taking that and not resting on your laurels, but finding new ways to push forward without losing the importance of the tradition.
So 3 whiskeys you've brought for us today. We're going to talk about the first 2 in this segment. You've just poured us a little bit of something. Tell us what it is. It smells delightful.
Yes. That's always the great way is to drink with your nose. This is Nikka. We're going to start off with Nikka, and this is their coffee grain whiskey. This is a relatively popular, for those who are drinking world whiskeys right now, example of this style. Coffee has nothing to do with the bean. That comes up a lot. People say, you can really smell the coffee.
Spelled Coffey.
That is exactly right. So it's named for a gentleman, Aeneas Coffey, who invented, or at least gets credit for the patent still, or what we call the double column distillation that started being able to make grain whiskeys in Scotland, which allowed to move from single malt Scotch whiskeys into the really teaching the world about whiskey through its export of grain whiskeys and specifically blends of whiskey. So blends of grain and single malts together, which give you something like the Bordeaux effect. You take the best possible ingredients, put them all together, and you get these beautiful layers of flavors that give you a sophistication that no one whiskey could give by itself.
And what did the column still have to do with that versus an alembic, a more traditional kind of still?
Sure. So we think of pot stills quite often when we talk about whiskey, or an alembic still would be quite traditionally for cognac, but similar idea. These are single pots that give you as much flavor extraction as possible from the grain. Column stills give you volume. Number one, which helps again from the economics of things. Usually economics drives most of the innovation everywhere around the world. But you also get some really beautiful notes, and quite often it's written off, the grain whiskeys and the column distilled grain whiskeys are written off as purely as blending stock. But in fact, as you'll see from this whiskey, it's a great way to start. It's soft and delicate, but it's incredibly nuanced. And there's really no place to hide when you create something on a column still that strips away so many of the impurities, but leaves, it's really what's left in the glass and what comes out of that barrel and in the master blender's hand that is so interesting.
I smell like caramel.
Caramel,
right? Caramel, is that right?
It
Absolutely,
is,
yeah.
Which really gives that impression of smoothness right off the bat, because I guess your palate is ready to have something that's going to be smooth with impressions of sweetness.
Yes, and of course, caramel really draws from the wood aging. And again, in Japan and Japanese whiskey making, they are unafraid to experiment with different woods. So we talked about some of the different sources. Of course, there's also Japanese oak, which is a completely different species of oak that'll go through. And which goes here? Well, the answer is probably all of the above. It's whatever you need to get the flavor profile you want, and that caramel is born from the wood.
We're drinking this neat, of course, nothing in the glass. And it's interesting. I found the first couple of seconds, like, eye opener is a little bit hot for me, but this beautiful long finish
And
that
lots
went
of
on for
complexity.
15 seconds in my mouth.
Yep. And it's always, I always say that to have a few sips, that first sip really wakes your palate up and gets you ready. And, unless you have my job, that maybe the first 45% pure whiskey that you've had of the day. Usually by this time of the day, it's not for me. Wonderfully, part of the great part of the gig. But beyond that, once you get your palate shock out of the way, then you really do get to see those top notes, the middle notes, those long, beautiful finish notes. And again, you wouldn't give a grain whiskey the credit to have a long, lasting finish that continues to evolve the way this does. But this is a prime example of how great a coffee still grain whiskey can be.
Wow,
Okay,
it's
by the way,
beautiful. What's our second one here?
Go ahead. Second one. All the information will be on our website, thefeedpodcast.com. Okay, so that was the Nika coffee grain. And what's this other one?
Okay, so now we're going to look at the other component of where we're going to go with number 3. So it's a little journey. And we're going to move from the Nika company and this distillery that made this, which is the northern end of, I think, the northernmost of the active distilleries on Honshu, the main island in Miyagi-ku. From the Nika company.
Good pronunciation, by the way.
Thank you. I've been working on it. My accent is terrible.
This is aged 12 years.
This is also from Nika.
So no, this is actually from Suntory, the Suntory
okay.
family. So what we have
Those
here,
are the two big houses.
these
right?
are the two big houses. So I wanted to, I'd love to come back and we could do 6 hours. We could walk through all the nuances. But to really understand Japanese, you start with the two big houses. When Takutsuru, when he left Tori and the Yamazaki company and left to form his own company, Nika, Hakushu, which we're going to move into, is part of that Suntory family. So we are just seeing a different side now. This is a single malt. It's a 12-year-old single malt that we're going to try. We're pretty used with that nomenclature. That means a minimum age of 12 aged in cask. Those casks, as we said, could be anything. But this would be some of that what should be bold flavoring stock. But as so often happens in Japanese whiskey production, you're inverting. So often the malts are soft and delicate, and your grains are actually some more flavorful than what you find with the malts. And I thought this was a great example of this.
I think this is much more delicate than that Nika.
Well, it certainly doesn't
right?
hit you right away
No.
with the aroma of that intense caramel and so forth. It's a much more nuanced nose.
Mm-hmm.
If wine has tannin, what would this have? How would you describe that sort of softer note?
You will see some tannin that comes from the barrel again, that effect, and you get that same stickiness in the gums, that bit of numbness. So it, in that wood aging, we know at least 50% of whiskey flavor comes from that oak aging, and the way that you then take the individual barrels, 2 barrels filled, same time, same warehouse, side by side, will give you very remarkably different whiskeys, and that's why the hand of the blender is so important to give you a consistent bottling. Every time you open a bottle of 12-year-old Hakushu, you hope that it tastes something like this, which is that beautiful green note towards the trail here. There's some eucalyptus for me.
Yeah, for sure that. So I would have this one, the Hakushu, first in the beginning of a meal or before I started the meal, and I would have the Nika coffee grain after the meal. That would describe my approach to them.
And what would these retail for, the Nika versus the Hakushu?
You'll find the Nika coffee grain and that distillation is a less expensive process. So this is coming in $65-$70 retail. This 12-year-old single malt's coming in around $80-$85 retail.
All right, when we come back, Kyle has one more spirit for us to taste, and we'll shift gears and talk sake with one of the nation's premier experts on the subject. We'll separate the Junmai from the Daiginjo, so stay with us.
Podcast. To get your weekly fix, subscribe to us on iTunes or visit our website, thefeedpodcast.com.
See behind-the-scenes photos and get additional information before other listeners. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/thefeedpodcast.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. We're talking with Kyle McHugh today, certified somm and master of whiskey, and you had one more whiskey to talk about today. This is
So we're moving into Ichiro's malt and grain whiskey. So now I wanted to go into the really weird side of some things that are happening in Japan, because, like I said, that steeped in culture and steeped in tradition, but you've got to be able to innovate. Unlike in Scotland, where most of the major houses were at some point part of the same company, and literally cousins of cousins are working, and you're sharing stocks and always have been. So you're able to get some very, very diverse flavors, even across company lines, as those have shifted over the hundreds of years. Japanese whiskey only having about 100 years of self-made history, the houses have rarely traded product. And so in order to get the kinds of depth of flavor that you're looking for, you've had to create that on your own, using different grains, different yeast, different production styles, different aging styles, etc. So this is from a relatively new distillery called Chichibu, and the owner and founder of Chichibu, Ichiro, is doing all kinds of creative things. So this is some of his grain whiskey and some of his malt whiskey combined with whiskeys from 8 other distilleries around the world that he's hand-selected barrels from. And it's got Canadian, Irish, Scotch, American, and English whiskeys in addition to the Japanese whiskeys he's selected.
It's a beautiful blend, and it has this... It's not over, maybe because I'm used to it by now. I've had a couple of whiskeys to taste, but it doesn't seem as harsh to me. But I just love how this is blended. It seems very smooth.
Absolutely. And that's the magic, again, of that blender's touch, is you're looking for something that you can sip on and go back to, and that's going to evolve in the glass. There's some fruit. There's some savory notes. I mean, really, it's...
Well, that's where I want to stop you with the savory notes, because I think they come out in the nose of it as well. I said it smells like you're in a room with some hard... ripe cheese. I mean, something that's been hanging around for a long time. Maybe there's a Parmesan in the corner or something like that. And when I was getting those savory notes on the nose, I thought, oh, we're in a different world here. It's not caramel for sure. It's really going into a different kind of complexity with reference to the flavors.
It'd be great if they could put this into like a spritzer. We could like do an air freshener with this kind of a thing. It'd be nice, wouldn't it? Have you walk in and have that little 8 blended scotches.
Oh my God! No, okay. I just tasted it. I was only smelling it before, but that's a pretty big explosion of flavors. But it's the whole thing is general. I say it's an explosion of flavors because there's such complexity to it. But it's a gentle thing all the way through. It's just a gorgeous sipping.
It's gorgeous.
Thing.
What would this retail for?
So this is the higher end of where we're at, and a lot of their whiskeys are very hard to come by. They're so new, and they're such in demand. But this is coming in. You can find it at 100 on the low end, more like 110 if you find it.
So special occasion, Ichiro's malt and grain whiskey.
Yep, exactly.
Right. Obviously, all the information is going to be on our website as well, thefeedpodcast.com. But Kyle McHugh, thanks for coming in today. Appreciate it.
This
My
has
pleasure.
been
Come
wonderful.
By. All right.
Come by.
Going to switch gears a bit now and shift over to sake. In the old days, I'll say, a decade ago, a lot of Japanese restaurants peddled warm sake from industrial cartons. We've learned since then that the exceptional sake should be served chilled. Our next guest is going to explain why this is so. She is Monica Samuels, the National Sake Sales Manager for Vine Connections, an importer that represents more than 15 artisanal sake breweries from Japan. She certainly racks up the more frequent flyer miles than anybody I know. If you follow her on Instagram, Monica, welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You are all over the world, all over the country, preaching sake education, right? Have you seen a huge spike in demand and interest?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, we've been importing sake and distributing to all 50 states for over a decade now, and we haven't had a single year where it hasn't grown. And other than 2009, where everything kind of fell, we've grown in double digits percentage-wise every year in places like Nebraska and South Dakota, and places where you would never think of as a great place to go drink premium sake, but it's out there.
Go ahead.
What do people need to know about sake that they don't know now in the U.S.?
Well, I think that the biggest misconception is that people think of sake as one flavor. Like they think of sake like vodka, right? And if someone really hates vodka, they're probably not going to find a vodka that's going to change their mind. But sake is like wine. There's a huge spectrum. And so when people still talk about sake as a singular flavor profile, especially when you see sake cocktails or recipes involving sake. And there's so many, like based on the amino acid content and the structure and the aroma, a cocktail or a recipe is going to taste totally different with one sake versus another. And so I think the most important thing is to appreciate the spectrum.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about that, because oftentimes people will say in our restaurant, they'll say, oh, I don't like sake. It's like that's like saying you don't drink wine.
Exactly.
I mean,
Is
there's
that
so
rooted?
many different
But is that
things.
rooted in that old, as I mentioned earlier,
Right.
people thinking about this warm sort of?
I think they haven't
product?
explored it.
They haven't
And
explored it.
There
They
is a
don't-
lot more because we will occasionally do a wine pairing. We'll do a sake pairing on one of our tasting menus in Topolobampo. We have one on right now, and it's spectacular with the food. But we will occasionally have those people that come in and they go, "Oh no, I don't drink sake," and it's like, "What? No, you've got to taste this because this may open your eyes to what sake can be."
And you're educating both people in the industry as well as consumers, right? So there's a difference there in terms of their understanding of what sake should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the area that it's resonated most with consumers is showing them sake and food, because I think with wine and food, people have a general idea of what works. You know, even someone who's not a wine person at all will, if they're shown a red and a white and a piece of steak and a piece of fish, they're going to say, well, the red's probably going to go with the steak.
Right.
And with sake, you can't give someone a really rustic junmai and a really fruity junmai and say, well, which is going to pair with the steak? You know, people don't know. And so having a clean slate like that with a consumer is really fun because they have to actually think about the pairing. And sake is great with food.
I liked how when I first reached out to you and I asked you to come on the show, I was asking, like, should we talk about junmai daiginjo? You said, you know what, let's talk about the properties, the characteristics,
right.
as opposed to those terms which are often get tossed around, right?
So I'm sure that there are like coordinates on. You can talk about sake as being sweet and dry. You can talk about sake as having a light body and a full body. What am I missing?
Well, so the reason I didn't want to talk about the polishing minimums is that that's the only thing that's legally required to be on the bottle, but it doesn't express itself in the glass. And so with wine, if you get to know a varietal, there are certain things that will always be true about that varietal, no matter where it's grown in the world and what the vintage. With sake, the rice polishing only tells you how much you can control your fermentation, really. So generally, if I smell or taste a sake, I either group it into a more umami-driven, savory, high-acid, rustic sake, or a more perfumed, floral, fruity, aromatic, low-acid style.
That's what I wanted to hear.
Can you do a brief refresher for people who don't know what you're talking about when you say polishing? What does that mean? Because there's 3 different types.
Yes.
Okay.
So sake rice is very different from table rice. All the starch is concentrated at the center of the grain. So the outer grains are proteins, minerals, vitamins, and fats that can create off flavors in sake and also accelerate fermentation. So if you want to have a really cold, slow fermentation, you have to remove a certain amount of rice bran from the outside. And that's really it. It doesn't determine the flavor or the style or the quality. It's much more, I would much rather have a not very much polished sake from a very small craft artisan brewery than the most polished sake from a very commercial, large production brewery.
Okay. So you brought us a couple of sakes to try today. What do you want to start with?
Well, I think we'll start here. So I brought, thinking about umami versus more aromatic, high-tone sakes, I brought one that's distinctly umami-rich and one that's distinctly perfumed and one that's kind of in the middle. So maybe,
and just in case people don't know what umami is, it's this 5th sense the Japanese came up with many, many years ago. It is a savoriness. It comes from soy sauce, cooked steak, mushrooms.
So it's basically a concentration of amino acid glutamates. And people, like a lot of wine people, say sake is very low in acid because they're thinking about wine acids. But sake is really high in acids, but they're just acids we're not used to. And so the enzyme that converts starch into sugar is found a lot in soy sauce and miso. And it's a great way to inoculate starch to turn it into sugar. And so a lot of those aromas like soy, caramel, miso, mushroom come out in sake. And so when we talk about umami, we talk about those savory characteristics.
Okay, so this is Eternal Embers.
Yes, so this is a producer called Yuho. I actually have 2 sakes, both made by women today, which is very unusual.
All right.
There are about 1,200 active sake breweries in Japan, and only 30 of them have female master brewers.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So I'm going to ask, why do we call them breweries and not wineries or whatever else they might be called?
Well, sake is not made from fruit, so I think technically it can't be called wine, although a lot of people call it rice wine, which I think is just a cooking term, right? People call mirin rice wine. Yeah. And sake is most similar in production to beer. I mean, after you convert the starch into sugar, then you add yeast and each sugar produces alcohol. So it's similar to beer, but a little more complicated because the starch to sugar conversion is happening at the same time as the sugar to alcohol conversion.
Oh, okay.
This has a roundness to it. It's very pleasant and
So
light.
this is the one that is more umami driven.
This is kind of in the middle.
This is kind of in the middle.
This is a good
because
one to calibrate your palate.
I was expecting, thank you.
Yeah.
I was expecting more umami in the nose from
Oh,
this.
we'll
We
get
have to,
there.
we have to calibrate our palate after all that whiskey, too, by the way.
Wow. I'm not sure this was exactly the right
The order.
flow here.
So this is a pretty natural style. You can see that there's a little bit of a color tint to it. Sake doesn't come out of the tank water white. Usually it comes out of the tank looking anywhere from straw colored to like a pale lemon green olive oil. So when you see no color at all in your sake, it's usually a sign that there's some sort of charcoal fining that's happened. So this is a little more of a natural approach. No charcoal fining.
It looks like a nice light white wine. And you're serving these in wine glasses, by the way.
Yes, sake is extremely expressive. I don't think that we drink anything good in shot glasses, right? I mean,
I agree with you
like-
there.
Well, no, you traditionally
But
have
the
it in the
traditional
wooden...
glasses
the
in
wooden
Japan are very
masu,
small.
right. And that's more of a cultural thing about the more times you can pour for someone
Right.
else, the more hospitality you're offering them. They're not thinking about how to showcase the sake. Premium sake is pretty new in Japan. It wasn't until after World War II that there was really a premium sake available in Japan. So a lot of these ancient customs are not based on very high quality sakes.
I see. Okay.
So you would have this with some nigiri, some sushi, or just a little what?
Well, let's talk about it. Maybe you can tell me.
All right. Well, it
so-
seems very light and a little bit fruit, but not much. But I wouldn't necessarily want to have it with like fried food or grilled food, maybe.
So one of the most common aromatics that you get on sake is banana, which this one definitely has, right? But it's not a tropical fresh banana. For me, this is more of kind of a banana bread, a baked banana.
Right.
And there's a lot of, there's a really pleasant yeasty characteristic, kind of like a brioche or like bread pudding quality. But it's more rustic in style. There's nothing fresh fruit about this. And I think when you take a sip,
I like how she's really analyzing it.
I think the acid's pretty pronounced. I mean,
Yeah.
it makes your mouth water. It goes on for a while. So this is something that, I mean, it's really hard to recommend sake with sushi because I have no idea what people are eating when they say they're eating sushi.
Right.
And if they drown their sushi in soy sauce and wasabi, it's totally going to throw off a pairing. So I like to talk about things that are pure, that you can't screw up with condiments. You must struggle with this all the time because people must destroy their food with too much.
Yes.
But-
Well, in some of our restaurants, yes, some no. But I will say that this sake is not too unlike the one that we're pouring right now. And we're doing it with a preparation from northwestern Mexico called an aguachile. So it's raw pieces of fish that get doused in a sauce, and the sauce is made almost exclusively from lime juice and chili and roasted garlic, and then in this one we put squid ink, which goes really beautifully with this, and that goes over the top, and then there's little bits of avocado, and there's some tropical fruit on there, and it's spectacular with a high acid sake like this one.
And that's amazing. Something that can handle the fat of avocado, the briny umami of squid ink, the spice, the citrus. I mean, it's hard to find a wine that can do all that. I think this is definitely a sake that can. I also like having this with aged Gouda. It's really good with charcuterie, like a rillette or chicken liver pate.
Right. That's that style.
Yeah,
Yes.
something that's got a little fat and funk
Right.
is really
And so
good.
is that part of your job to get people to think about sake with food that's not Japanese?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, because you can leave a bottle of sake open for, a month at home. And so that's the great thing. Like, we really want to create a culture where people can have a bottle of sake open in their fridge all the time. And if they're having Chinese leftovers, if they're having, they're putting out some cheese and having people over, it seems really elegant and sophisticated to pull out some sake and kind of giving them the ability to experiment with the same sake over several weeks to see what their favorite is really fun.
I'd love to try this with like a prosciutto and some
Yes.
fruit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
prosciutto
okay.
and melon would be great.
Melon.
Okay. All right.
Yes,
what,
because the flavor of this would
all
go
right,
well with
dumping
melon.
this out. Rick, don't drink out of that glass.
Okay, I'm gonna
Dumping
try
into.
it.
Okay.
Last time I did.
Should I rinse mine a little bit for the next one?
Sure, if you
Okay.
want to. So this is the next sake. It's another sake made by a woman. The first sake that we had is in Ishikawa Prefecture. Ishikawa is more kind of, it's straight across from Tokyo. If Tokyo's in the middle of the country on the East Coast, all the way west, you'd get to Ishikawa. This is more in the southwest in Hiroshima. Hiroshima has some of the softest water in Japan, and sake is 80% water, and there's no filtration done to the water. So you're really getting a pure expression of the texture and minerality of the local water. This is very soft water, so they're known for very, very slow, low temperature fermentation, so these should really jump out of the glass.
This is even lighter than the previous one.
Yeah.
In color.
Yeah, in
Yes.
color.
Yeah.
In color.
So this is definitely, juicy, fresh fruit. Pineapple, pastis, violet. Like it's really explosive.
Wow, that is delicious. A lot of
Well,
fruit.
I haven't tasted it yet because I can't get past that gorgeous nose.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That is really
Very
beautifully
fruity.
expressive. Wow. Okay. So is it lighter in color and on the palate? Because the last one was, I would call it a medium one.
This seems lighter, yeah. I don't know. I want to just drink this. I don't need to eat anything. This is fantastic. But there's much more fruit pronounced in this.
I think body, this is the same. This is
It's
medium,
the
but
same.
it's very low in acid and very low in umami. So it totally, you would go in a different direction with this. Like I really like having this with like scallop crudo with grapefruit and good olive oil and fennel. Like there's so much fennel that comes out in the sake that I think you can do
see
some
that.
fun herbaceous pairings. But
Gosh,
it's
I
softer.
want to have that for dinner with this. That sounds really fabulous.
It just seems like it's there's so much that could go with this.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
very
it
versatile.
even goes with
Well,
chocolate.
but it
Really?
reminds me, though, of like crossing over in the border from Alsace into Germany and some of those very floral, fruity wines that you would get there. It's dry on the palate, but boy, it's so expressive in the fruit that it makes me think, oh, this is soft dry. It's soft dry, but it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
It cleans up completely.
Yeah,
It's dry
that's a
on the
great
palate.
comparison.
All right, listen, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Monica has one more sake for us to try. Then we're going to wrap things up and preview some scenes from next week's show. So stay with us.
How about a buttery, flaky croissant, some crispy Korean fried chicken, or some tasty Kentucky bourbon? From breakfast to that final nightcap, listen to the Feed Podcast's catalog on iTunes to find the perfect flavors that fit your mood.
Have a beef with something you heard? Looking for a little extra side dish? Let us know on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at The Feed Podcast.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. We're talking with Monica Samuels, the National Sake Sales Manager for Vine Connections. We tried two sakes in the previous segment. We're going to finish with one more. Also a female producer?
No,
Okay.
I think looking at the label, it's
Oh,
very
cowboy.
distinctly masculine.
Does that say cowboy?
Yes.
With a steer on there.
Yes. So Japanese people are really into Westerns and cowboys, and it's a big thing from way back when. So I look at this label and I see something that looks very Japanese to me in a very retro way. But this is a Yamahai style, as you can see on the label. Yamahai is a little more of a wild, kind of feral way of making sake. It's an ancient way of preparing the yeast starter that involves a lot more interaction with wild yeast and bacteria. So it's usually higher in overall acid and has a lot more umami and kind of these gamey, smoky notes. So we had something that was kind of medium to calibrate your palate. We had extreme fragrant, fruity, floral, and now we're going to have extreme umami. This one almost has like a beef jerky note on the nose to me. It's really, I think it distinctly is something that goes with meat.
Looks are so deceiving because you look at it, it looks a lot like the previous one. It's so clear and light.
Clear and light looking, but oh man, on the nose it's not.
Yeah,
No.
it's like chocolate and smoke and spice.
Oh,
Now, would you ever
wow.
sort of categorize the aperitif versus the after dinner
Oh, totally.
types?
Yeah.
And this would be my after dinner thing.
After
well, like you
dinner
said, it
or
goes
like
with
a big
chocolate.
red.
No, with a big
Yeah.
red. Yeah, like instead of a big red cab, you could have this with meat or
Totally.
anything smoked duck.
And I think, especially if you think about Korean barbecue and more Japanese influenced steakhouses, there's a lot of like gochujang and flavors that would really mess up a big red wine pairing with meat. And so this can be really fun as an alternative.
This
Yeah,
is
I
so
think this would
surprising.
stand up to all that gochujang and those funky flavors. When you said Korean barbecue, I was like, this would be what I want to drink with that.
Because you could have it with the
it's really
seafood
fun.
pancake. You could have it with the beef that's grilled. You could have all the vegetables, the funkiness, the fermented vegetables.
Stands up to the smell.
Right?
I'm there.
So what do these retail for? The first two?
So the first two are going to be, the first one's going to be about $30 a bottle. The second one is going to be about $39 a bottle.
Still great.
And the third one would be somewhere in the middle, maybe like $36.
Was
All
that right?
really
And these are
reasonable.
all 750s?
$720s. So everything's Everything's around the 180 milliliter measurement in Japan. That's how you used to buy rice. And like if you see those wooden masu cups,
Right.
those are 180 milliliters. So, and if you go to a bar, you can order one of those. But this is 4 of them. So 4, it's called a go. So 4 go is the 720 milliliter.
I see. Okay.
This has been great.
Sort of
Thank-
like what we consider a wine
Right.
bottle.
Yeah.
Well, kampai, as they say.
Kampai.
Oh,
Thanks
this
for
has
having
been
me.
fabulous.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Monica Samuels is the National Sake Sales Manager for Vine Connections. Monica, arigatou gozaimasu.
どういたしまして。
Coming up next week, we tackle the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace.
The celebrated humor of kitchens is no holds barred, crass, dirty, sexualized humor. And the first thing I had to do if I was going to have any part in a conversation moving forward was stand up and say, like, I did this too.
We'll talk to the reporter in New Orleans who broke the story about John Besh, as well as 2 female chefs, one from New York City, one from Chicago, who have written stories in national magazines about the issue. That's next week on the show.
You can always contact us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at The Feed Podcast. You can also check out our ingredient challenges, get recipes and other information about previous shows by simply visiting our website, thefeedpodcast.com. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the show on iTunes. Be sure to follow me at Rick_Bayless.
And I'm at Steve Dolinsky. More information about the whiskey and sakes we talked about today on our website as well. Linnea Dominic's our production assistant. Max Dolinsky supervised today's music. Bureaucratic wrote and performed our theme song. And the Feed Podcast is edited by Matt Cunningham at Truthful Enthusiasm. Whether you're an individual or institution, get your story online with truthfulenthusiasm.com. Thanks for listening, everybody.